Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host of the Los Altos History Show this evening. Our guest, Yvonne Jacobson, and I have been looking through an album of old photographs that speak of the era of farming here in Los Altos and Los Altos Hills. This time of year sometimes makes people nostalgic for the time when our valley was planted with fruit trees, and when in early springtime there were a sea of blossoms everywhere. That time interested our guest Yvonne so much that what began as a family project evolved into a book called Passing Farms, Enduring Values. This book is a very interesting one. It's filled with wonderful photographs, and I highly recommend it to you. Yvonne Jacobson was born and raised in the heart of Santa Clara Valley. She attended local schools, including Stanford University, where she majored in English. And after obtaining a master's degree in English from Columbia University, Yvonne traveled to South Africa, where she married a fellow Stanford student. The two returned to Santa Clara Valley in 1963 and have resided here ever since. Yvonne has been a lecturer at San Jose State University and De Anza College, and she's also a trustee for the California History Center located at De Anza. Yvonne was born into a farming family, the Olsons, whose cherry orchard is a familiar landmark, a very well-loved landmark on the El Camino in Sunnyvale. I want to thank Yvonne for being with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Santa Clara County has been called the Blossom Valley often, and recently I've heard of another term, a delightful one, the Valley of Heart's Delight.
Yes.
How did that ever come into usage, Yvonne?
In 1915, when San Francisco had recovered from the 1906 earthquake, they decided to throw a big party. It was called the Pan American Exposition of 1915, and our local newspapers in San Jose decided to run a competition to see what kind of title might come up that could be used to describe the county in a way that would be catchy. And the Valley of Heart's Delight won the competition, and for good reason. The valley had perfect temperature, it was a beautiful agricultural valley, and it afforded people a very fine place to live.
Well, it's a delightful name, and I just recently was able to view a film, a documentary film that we're going to be rolling in some footage of in this piece that was entitled The Valley of Heart's Delight. But the valley was not always planted in orchard. We know from a previous show on the Ohlone civilization that the indigenous people lived off the land and from the bay, but they were really not farmers. So I thought maybe it would be useful for the viewer if we could chronologue the uses of the land over time, so that we can properly set this agricultural period of fruit farming where it belongs. So after the Spanish actually made conquest of what we know now as California, more particularly Santa Clara Valley, how did this conquest really change the use of the land? What was it that changed here? As you said, the Indians didn't do agriculture, but the Spanish introduced a type of agriculture referred to as mission agriculture, and it was an extensive type
called extensive because it used large areas of land, in this case to raise cattle. They raised the cattle not for the beef, but for the hides and the tallow, which were sent by Spanish barks or boats that came into the bay near Alviso to pick up the hides and the tallow and taken all the way back to Spain to the king for the king's
approval, or
not his approval, but to be changed into money to make him his coffers richer. And essentially, this was a colony run on behalf of the King of Spain.
So the Spanish then had really no accurate reporting about the land that they were using. It was just all of theirs. Is that correct?
That it was all theirs, and the missions defined between each mission, halfway between each mission, was the general boundary. Nobody worried about boundaries. There was so much land, and they essentially placed the missions about 1 day's ride apart to make it convenient. And also, they didn't want to have to ride in the nighttime because there were hostile Indians all around them, and so they placed them in a kind of distance that would make it safe for them to travel.
I see. So, how did the land change when the Mexican government took over? Well,
the Spanish were here from 1777 until 1822, when Mexico threw off the yoke of Spain and claimed the lands of California as their own colony. And at that time, the parceling out of the lands in Santa Clara County, and it's happened all through California at the same time, were granted over or deeded over to people who had in some way served the state of Mexico. And here in Los Altos Hills, there are 2 grants that date back to that era.
And those are?
The Purísima Concepcion, which is Los Altos Hills today, and the Rancho San Antonio,
I was going to say,
which is makes up part of Los Altos.
Okay. So these particular ranchos, they all had a different function, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Well, they each have an interesting history. The Spanish measured their land in leagues, which was about rounded to 4,400 acres per league. And in this case, each of those ranchos were about 1 league. The Rancho San Antonio had been awarded to a soldier who was well respected. He was known for having caught and beheading the renegade Indian Yoscolo. And in fact, he took the head and planted it on a stake in front of the mission to deter any other Indians who might think of challenging the authority of the army. And he was granted the land, but he didn't have a chance, much chance to enjoy it, because he died shortly after. And then his family, his wife died, so there was a family of about 8 or 10 children orphaned, and they had debts to pay, so the land was then almost immediately sold and was bought by 2 Americans, the Dana brothers. They used the land to run cattle, and then subsequently it was used to raise grains, because if we keep our dates in view, in 1848 was the discovery of gold, and yes, then 300,000 people rushed into California in the ensuing year, and the result was a need for, all of a sudden, a need for flour. So grain became one of the main crops to be grown on the lands in Los Altos and in Los Altos Hills.
Now, these ranchos were very, very large tracts of land. Is that correct?
They were small domains. Right. They were like little kingdoms.
Were there any problems in managing those lands?
Well, the problems arose an interesting example is the Los Altos Hills Rancho. That history, it was originally granted to 2 Indians who had served the mission very well and the Mexican government. And they then sold it for $300 to Juana Briones, and $300, that works out to about 14 cents an acre.
Wow. We're not really hearing this, are we?
Then Juana Briones, who was a very resourceful woman, also ran cattle on it, but she then leased it to Martin Murphy Jr., who was a large landholder in Sunnyvale. Yes. And he subsequently bought it from her. He then deeded it over to his daughter, Elizabeth Yuba Tafe, and unfortunately her husband died, and then she died, and well, I think it was the reverse. She died first, and the children were orphans. Now, in the next generation, there was another death in the family, and also at the same time, one of the brothers had put a tremendous debt on the land. And so eventually all that property was sold in small parcels, and the Tafe family still has a presence today in Los Altos Hills, fortunately.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So there is a connection with with this long line. But the moral of it was that for various reasons, sometimes out of their control, property had to be sold, and or in some cases also the lifestyle was such that they didn't care to work. They expected income from the land but didn't work the land, and the result was eventually it was sold because they had debts they couldn't pay.
They just used it up, so to speak.
That's correct.
Right. Now you have a couple of pictures that you brought along?
Yes, this one shows one of the early adobes on an adjacent,
the camera will pick this up.
Adjacent rancho, which is on where Sears Roebuck is today. Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting adobe. The Secundindo Robles, who built the adobe, had 29 children.
Oh,
and they helped him run it as a cantina during the years, and it fell down in the 1906 earthquake. Not all the farms were given over to the raising of crops. Some of them were pleasure farms. In fact, this area attracted wealthy people who wanted to have a summer residence here.
Were they large farms or
well,
ranches?
some of them were large. In this case, this was owned by a very colorful man, Louis O'Neill, who was one of the political bosses of Santa Clara County.
Oh,
and
that's what I understand.
He had 1,100 acres up on the top of Page Mill, and in this photograph we can see a large group of people having gathered along Page Mill, and in the background there are vineyards, which we'll talk about perhaps later. And but they had come up there for a huge barbecue. I believe at one time he had 1,200 people there for a barbecue, and even
1,200
horse races on the Page Mill Road.
Oh, this is a wonderful photograph.
Which shows Louis O'Neill there where the X is, racing on his Palomino against.
It really looks like the Wild West.
It was, in fact, it was quite a colorful place, and it had a very interesting history.
Oh, that's fascinating. So what you're saying is that what we need to understand is that the tracts of land kept, being pared down from the original ranchos.
And they're still being pared down today into smaller and smaller units,
as we know.
Right.
From the large rancho to the wheat or grain farm, and then finally to the fruit farm. When we think of California, we often think of, in agriculture, we think of wine. Were there any wineries here? There were.
The hills were dotted with vineyards. And as early as 1876, John Snyder, who was a large landowner near the intersection of 280 and Foothill Expressway, in that area, he owned between 700 and 800 acres of land. He built one of the first wineries in this area in the 1870s, And you can see the horses lined up pulling,
oh yes, with the barrels going
the
up.
barrels of wine, taking them down to the Mountain View Railroad Depot, where they would be taken to San Francisco to be used as a blend with other wines. It was a very big industry in Santa Clara County, and our area had its share of vineyards.
Well, what happened? I mean, why did they give way to the fruit farm?
Well, in the 1890s, the vineyards were struck by a root louse, which is called phylloxera, and it destroyed the vineyards. And the farmers then, for a variety of reasons, turned to fruit growing. One of the reasons was that it was discovered that a family of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 could subsist quite comfortably on a small acreage of land which was planted to fruit trees. So, say it was 10 acres or 20 acres. One family could take care of that amount of...
one family?
Yes,
then.
one family would be able to care for that acreage without hiring extra help. And therefore, it made it economical for a family to buy a 10-acre piece and to put in the money that was needed to start the orchard, and then to, over the years, harvest the crops and
continue
make a
forward.
living. Yes.
Now, were the people originally here in California? Were they coming in from other places? How did it sort of catch on?
The railroads had a great deal to do with promoting the virtues of land in California to the farmers.
We've heard this before.
Yes. The Southern Pacific Railroad was not only a landowner itself, a large landowner in California, but of course it sold the tickets to bring the people to California, so they had a vested interest in
fascinating.
To promoting people to come here, and they did put out a tremendous amount of brochures. In fact, they had their own magazine, monthly magazine called the Overland Monthly, and it really had some very fine writers who contributed to it. But in a sense, it was a promotional piece for the Southern Pacific Railroad.
And you brought one of those brochures along, did you not?
Yes, I did. I brought one that was put out by the Board of Manufacturers in San Jose in the 1880s. And in it, they describe what you might need to start up a farm in Santa Clara County.
Oh, this will be interesting.
Yes.
So the costs involved? And,
yes, yes. They had it worked out. Of course, what they don't mention here are the vicissitudes that you might encounter if it rains too much, or if it rains too little, or if you don't have enough frost, or if you have too much frost, and all the other things that can happen to a farmer.
Exactly.
But they left that for you to find out once you got here, and it was too late. But essentially, they say that land in Santa Clara County in the 1880s could be had for $75 to $300 per acre.
Per acre?
Yes. And that
was quite a bit of money, though, actually.
Yes, it was quite a bit of money. And in fact, when they give you 10 acres of land, say at $200, that's $2,000 for the property, and the cultivation costs at $20, 750 trees at 20 cents each, $150. The planting is $60, and the cultivation after the planting, the total came to $2,250 would be your entire outlay. But they also go on to predict that once you had this orchard running, this property would be much more valuable, and if you wanted to sell it, then you would realize a very good profit. So
the American dream, right?
Right, exactly.
Right. Well, how many farms do you estimate there were in Los Altos and Los Altos Hills in the early part of the century?
Well, the best the best way for me to answer that is to say that the greatest number of farms in this county were in the 1920s, when the plantings had reached a height. I think there were 125,000 acres in cultivation in the 1920s.
Just in this area?
Just in Santa Clara County.
In Santa Clara County.
And my best guess is that in our corner of the county, Los Altos and Los Altos Hills, we probably had no more than 300 to 350 farms. Maybe one could say less than 500 and be safe. But what we did have here was the exceptional apricots. This was considered to be the area for growing the finest tasting apricots in the whole valley.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, it was a combination of the soil and the amount of sunshine and the amount of rain and the frost in the wintertime. I mean, all of these things combined to produce particularly delicious and beautiful golden Blenheim apricot.
Apricots.
Yes.
So are there any remnants of any of those Los Altos or Los Altos Hills farms still here today, Yvonne?
There are a few around in Los Altos, around the History House, the Smith House.
Of course, sure.
And the library and the
whole civic center.
The whole civic center is today farmed by Don Speciale, who is works with the city to take care of the farms there. In Los Altos Hills, there is the Packard family who has put 25 acres, I believe, of hillside apricots into a trust so that it can be kept in perpetuity as a producing orchard. Right. Then there is a little winery that is working on Page Mill Road called Page Mill Winery. And Mr. Stark puts out about 2,000 cases of wine a year. And I just spoke to him this evening, and he said that he has 3 neighbors adjacent to him who are each now raising between 1/2 and an acre of grapes. He buys from 2 of them, and the 3rd individual sells to yet another winery. So we have a little mini winery operation going on there.
That's interesting. Now, in terms of the apricots, they were very perishable. They are a very perishable fruit.
They are.
How did the farmer get them to market?
Well, there were 2 or 3 ways a farmer could market. One was to cut the apricots on his own farm and put them on trays and then into a sulfur house where they are cured, and sell them and dry them in the sun, and then sell them as dried apricots to one of the buyers who would come around from various sources who interested in buying dried fruit, dried apricots. The other thing was many of the small farmers belonged to co-ops. Santa Clara County was a hotbed of farmer co-ops, and out of our valley came one of the most successful co-ops, and that's Sunsweet. It was the Prune and Apricot Growers Association.
Yes. Yes.
And today it is still in existence as one of the most successful stories relating to the co-op.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, this time has gone so quickly, Yvonne. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. About this very wonderful era in the Los Altos history, because so many of the residents have such a keen interest in this particular facet of our history. And I thank you again for enlightening us about what it is that takes it to be a farmer here in this valley, or was. We were able to pull together a collection of old photographs and video footage from the documentary that I mentioned called The Valley of Heart's Delight, which was originally produced in 1922, as well as some current video to show you where to find the reminders of this time past that Yvonne and I have just discussed. We hope you've enjoyed this evening's show, and please join us next time for the Los Altos History Show. Goodbye for now, and let's roll that tape now.
On this day, in this place, would have argued for an instant with Roscoe Wyatt when he said, "In this valley of Heart's Delight, you will find life pleasurable, toil honorable, and recreation plentiful."
Orchards demand dedication and hard work year-round. Lyle Hustis, who grew up on an apricot orchard on the border of Los Altos and Mountain View, recalls in her diary, "My parents worked hard to produce healthy trees that in turn would yield 100-fold. Each season exacted its fair share. In the fall and winter months, trees were pruned to make way for the new growth. Machinery, tools, lugs, and trays were repaired. Wells were drilled. In the spring, the orchards were cultivated and sprayed for pests and blight." After the trees blossomed in late February or early March, the fear of frost always hovered. Smudge pots were often used to raise the temperature in the orchard in the very early hours of the morning in order to protect the fragile crop. Each tree received a personal going over. The fruit clusters on the trees were thinned because a larger or fancier fruit brought a better price. Near the end of June, the fruit would be ready to be picked, dried, or sold. The canneries would pick up filled picking boxes or lugs and deliver empties daily. This was an all-out effort with everyone pitching in to help, both young and old alike. Often friends, neighbors, and families rallied to the cause. Dried fruit was a large part of the apricot harvest. Apricots were sulfured to retain color and disinfect. Then the apricots were dried on large trays in the sun before being packed for market. The kernels or pits of the apricots were packed in sacks and sold abroad to Germany to be used in the production of Laetrile. Farmers in Santa Clara County formed co-ops where their fruit harvest would be packed and shipped all over the world. These colorful labels identify the fruit and packers in Santa Clara County and are now collector's items. The packing was done primarily by women. There were 20 pounds to the box, 50 boxes to the half-ton. A good fruit picker could earn between $2 to $3 per 10-hour day. Nearby canneries employed women as well on a seasonal basis. The women returned year after year to augment the family's yearly income. The 10-hour shift, based on piecework, averaged about $2 a day. The most nostalgic of memories revolve around the blossom. There are still reminders of that long past time in tiny pockets dotting the Los Altos and Los Altos Hills landscape. Apricot trees are a focal point around the Civic Center of Los Altos. The Gilbert Smith farmhouse on the Civic Center property is now the History House Museum. The 10-acre Smith farm was donated by the Smiths to the city of Los Altos at the time of the city's incorporation. There are small pockets of rural Los Altos sprinkled around the city. You must search them out and use your imagination, however. For example, this property is on Los Altos Avenue, now a main crosstown thoroughfare in Los Altos. This property on the corner of Pine Lane and Los Altos Avenue has a tank house where once water was stored for irrigation. Today, there are still some acres dedicated to fruit farming in Los Altos Hills. This Federal Express truck rushing by in this charming scene in Los Altos Hills probably sums up best the incongruity of living in this area. But if you take the time to uncover these pockets, you can recapture, if only for a moment, the remnants of the Valley of Heart's Delight.